My son demanded I pay for his entire wedding, claiming it was my duty as his mother. When I refused, he cut me off completely, saying I was selfish and didn't deserve to be part of his new family. But 3 months later, when the prenup I secretly funded was revealed in court, the look on his face was worth every penny I'd spent to protect the woman he was destroying. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while I was tending to my garden. The roses were blooming beautifully that June, their petals soft as silk against my weathered fingers. At 72, gardening had become my meditation, my way of staying connected to life after Harold's passing 2 years prior. "Mom, we need to talk." Marcus's voice carried that demanding tone I'd learned to recognize over the years. My eldest son, now 35, had inherited his father's sharp business mind, but none of his compassion. I brushed the soil from my hands and settled into my kitchen chair, the same spot where I'd received countless calls over the decades. Good news, bad news, everything in between. This felt different, though. There was an edge to his voice that made my stomach tighten. "What's on your mind, sweetheart?" "Brianna and I set a date, October 15th. We want a proper wedding, and we need your help." Relief flooded through me. After 3 years of dating, Marcus was finally ready to marry Brianna Chen, a sweet kindergarten teacher who'd brought light back into my son's eyes after his messy divorce from his first wife. I'd grown fond of her gentle nature, the way she remembered small details about my life, how she'd helped me organize Harold's memorial service when Marcus had been too busy with work. "That's wonderful news. I'm so happy for you both. What kind of help do you need?" The pause that followed should have warned me. I'd raised 3 children, weathered enough family storms to recognize the silence before lightning strikes. "We need you to pay for it, the whole thing." The words hit me like a physical blow. "Excuse me?" "The venue alone is $45,000. Catering for 200 guests, flowers, photography, band, dress, everything. We're looking at about $90,000 total." $90,000. The number hung in the air between us, absurd and impossible. My teacher's pension and Harold's modest life insurance provided comfort, not extravagance. We'd always lived within our means, saved carefully, but $90,000 was nearly half my entire nest egg. "Marcus, that's an enormous amount of money. Have you considered something smaller, more intimate?" "Mom." His voice took on that patronizing tone he'd perfected in his corporate job. "This isn't negotiable. Brianna deserves the wedding of her dreams, and as my mother, supporting your son's marriage should be your priority." Should be my priority. As if 35 years of loving, supporting, and sacrificing for him meant nothing unless I bankrupt myself for one day. I thought of the years I'd worked 2 jobs to put him through college, the down payment I'd helped him make on his first house, the countless ways I'd stretched our budget to give him opportunities Harold and I never had. I want to help, but $90,000 would wipe out most of my savings. Surely you can understand. "Can't understand?" "Mom, I make 6 figures. Brianna and I will be fine financially, but this is about family. This is about showing that you care about our happiness." The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost fell for it. Almost. But something in his tone, the casual way he dismissed my financial security, sparked something deeper than hurt. Anger. "If you make 6 figures, why can't you pay for your own wedding?" "Because that's not how families work. Parents pay for weddings. It's tradition." Tradition. As if tradition meant impoverishing your elderly mother for a party? As if the tradition of honoring and caring for your parents didn't matter at all. "I'm sorry, Marcus, but I can't do it. I can contribute $5,000, but that's my limit." The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "5,000?" His voice was ice. "For your only son's wedding? $5,000? It's what I can afford without jeopardizing my future security." "Your future security." He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Mom, you're 72. How much future do you really need to secure?" The cruelty of those words stole my breath. How much future did I need? As if my remaining years were worthless. As if I should spend my final decades in poverty so he could have one perfect day. "Marcus, that's a terrible thing to say." "It's realistic. Brianna's parents are contributing $30,000. Her uncle is paying for the flowers. Even her college friends are throwing her a bridal shower that costs more than you're offering. Do you know how embarrassing this is for me?" Embarrassing. Not disappointing, not hurtful. Embarrassing. Because his mother, who'd given him everything she had for 35 years, couldn't give him everything she had left. "I'm sorry you feel embarrassed by my financial limitations." This isn't about limitations, Mom. This is about priorities, about what matters to you. What mattered to me? The son I'd rocked through countless fevers, cheered at every soccer game, celebrated through every achievement. The boy who'd once told me I was his best friend, who'd promised to take care of me when I got old. That son was demanding I choose between his happiness and my survival. "Marcus, I love you. I want you to have a beautiful wedding, but I cannot and will not spend $90,000. "Fine." The word was sharp as broken glass. "If that's how you want to play this, then maybe you shouldn't come to the wedding at all." My heart stopped. What? If you can't support your son's marriage, then you don't deserve to be part of it. Don't call me again until you're ready to do the right thing. The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen for an hour, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring again, waiting for him to call back and apologize, to tell me he'd been stressed and didn't mean those awful things. Waiting for my son to remember he was talking to his mother, not a business adversary. The phone remained silent. 3 days passed, then a week. I called twice, but the calls went straight to voicemail. I sent a text message asking if we could talk, explaining that I loved him and wanted to work things out. No response. 2 weeks after that horrible conversation, I drove to his office downtown. The receptionist, a young woman I'd met at the company Christmas party, looked uncomfortable when she saw me. "Mrs. Patterson, I'm sorry, but Mr. Patterson left specific instructions not to allow any visitors today. I'm his mother." "I know, ma'am. I'm truly sorry." The humiliation burned like acid in my chest. My own son had instructed his employees to bar me from his workplace. I was being treated like a stalker, a threat to be managed and contained. I tried calling Brianna directly, hoping she might be more reasonable. The call went to voicemail, but she didn't return it. A week later, I tried again. This time she answered. "Hello, Mrs. Patterson." Her voice was polite but distant, nothing like the warm affection I'd grown accustomed to. "Brianna, sweetheart, I was hoping we could talk about this wedding situation. I feel like there's been a misunderstanding." "I don't think there's been any misunderstanding. Marcus told me about your conversation." "Did he tell you I offered to contribute $5,000? That I'm happy to help in other ways, maybe with planning or—" "Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate the offer, but we've made other arrangements. My parents have agreed to cover the additional costs." Other arrangements? As if I were a vendor who'd failed to meet their specifications, easily replaced by a more accommodating supplier. "Brianna, this isn't about money. This is about family. Marcus is my son, and I don't want this disagreement to—" "I think it's best if we give Marcus some space right now. He's very hurt by your refusal to support our marriage." My refusal to support their marriage? Not my inability to afford their extravagant demands, but my refusal. As if I'd chosen to withhold help out of spite rather than necessity. "I do support your marriage. I just can't afford—" "I have to go. Take care, Mrs. Patterson." The line went dead, leaving me with the devastating realization that I hadn't just lost my son. I'd lost the young woman I'd hoped would be my daughter, the person I'd believed might bridge the growing gap between Marcus and me. That night, I called my daughter Rachel in Portland. She listened quietly as I explained what had happened, her occasional sharp intakes of breath the only indication of her reaction. "Mom, that's insane. $90,000? Does he have any idea what that would mean for your financial security?" "Apparently, he thinks I don't need much security at my age." Rachel was quiet for a long moment. "Mom, there's something I need to tell you about Marcus, something I probably should have mentioned before." My chest tightened. "What is it?" "He's been asking David and me for money too, not for the wedding, but for other things. The down payment on his new BMW, some investment opportunity that fell through. He wanted us to co-sign a loan for a vacation rental property." "Did you help him?" "We gave him $5,000 last year when he said he was having cash flow problems at work. But David got suspicious when Marcus bought that BMW 3 months later. We started wondering if the money problems were real or if he was just used to other people solving them." Other people solving them? Like his mother, who'd been solving his problems for 35 years. "Rachel, why didn't you tell me this before?" "Because I hoped he'd grow out of it. Because he's our brother, and I wanted to believe he was just going through a rough patch. But Mom, what he's doing to you isn't okay. It's financial abuse." Financial abuse? The term felt foreign, wrong somehow. How could it be abuse when he was my son? But as Rachel explained the pattern, the excessive demands, the emotional manipulation, the threats to cut off contact unless I complied, I began to see the situation differently. What should I do? Stand your ground. Don't let him guilt you into poverty. And Mom, maybe it's time to think about protecting yourself legally. Protecting myself legally? From my own son? The thought should have been unthinkable, but as the weeks stretched into months without a word from Marcus, it began to feel like wisdom rather than betrayal. I started doing research. I consulted with an attorney about financial planning for seniors, about protecting assets from family members who might take advantage. The lawyer, a kind woman named Janet Morrison, listened to my story with professional compassion. "Mrs. Patterson, what you're describing is unfortunately common. Adult children who view their parents' assets as their own inheritance, who use emotional manipulation to access those funds before the parent actually passes away." "But he's not asking for his inheritance early. He just wants help with the wedding." $90,000? With threats to cut off contact if you refuse? Mrs. Patterson, that's not asking for help. That's financial coercion. Financial coercion? Another term I'd never imagined applying to my relationship with my son. What can I do to protect myself? Several things. First, we can set up trusts that protect your assets while still allowing you to access them. Second, we can create documentation that makes it clear any future gifts are loans that must be repaid. And third, we can establish legal boundaries that prevent anyone from pressuring you into financial decisions. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was paying a lawyer to protect me from the child I'd devoted my life to raising. But something else had been nagging at me, a worry that went deeper than my own financial security. During my research, I'd stumbled across some troubling information about prenuptial agreements, or rather, the lack thereof. Marcus had mentioned nothing about a prenup, which seemed odd for someone so focused on money and financial planning. I'd always liked Brianna. She was kind, hardworking, and seemed genuinely devoted to Marcus. But she was also young, trusting, and, from what I could tell, had no idea about her fiancé's history of financial manipulation. If Marcus was willing to emotionally blackmail his own mother for wedding money, what would he do to a wife who trusted him completely? The thought haunted me. Brianna came from a modest background. Her parents, both teachers, who'd saved carefully to contribute $30,000 to their daughter's wedding. She had no significant assets of her own, no family wealth to fall back on. If the marriage failed, she'd be left with nothing, while Marcus retained all his property, his business interests, his carefully protected wealth. I found myself thinking about Harold's sister, Margaret, who'd married a charming man who'd convinced her not to worry about unromantic things like prenups. When the marriage ended 8 years later, Margaret discovered that all the property they'd acquired during their marriage was in his name only. She'd worked as a bookkeeper throughout their marriage, contributing to the household expenses while he invested in real estate and business ventures. When the divorce was finalized, she walked away with nothing but her personal belongings and half their credit card debt. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that Brianna needed protection. Not from Marcus as a person, but from the financial vulnerability that comes with trusting someone completely. She deserved to enter marriage with her eyes open, with legal safeguards that would protect her if the worst happened. But how could I help her when I'd been cut off from both of them? How could I protect someone who probably saw me as the selfish mother-in-law who'd refused to pay for her dream wedding? The answer came to me during one of my conversations with Janet Morrison. We were discussing ways to protect my own assets when she mentioned a case she'd handled years earlier. The grandmother was concerned about her grandson's bride-to-be, Janet explained. The young woman came from a difficult background, had no family support, no financial knowledge. The grandmother worried that if the marriage failed, the girl would be left destitute. So she hired me to draft a prenuptial agreement that protected both parties fairly, then arranged for the bride to receive independent legal representation. Without the grandson knowing? The grandson assumed his bride had hired her own lawyer. The grandmother's involvement remained confidential. Both parties signed a fair agreement, and when the marriage did end 3 years later, both walked away with appropriate assets. A fair prenuptial agreement. Independent legal representation for Brianna. A way to protect her without revealing my involvement, without giving Marcus another reason to paint me as interfering or manipulative. Could something like that work in my situation? Janet considered it carefully. It's possible, but it would require delicate handling. The bride would need to believe she was getting the legal advice on her own initiative or from another source. And the agreement would need to be genuinely fair to both parties, not designed to punish your son. Punish my son? That wasn't what I wanted at all. Despite everything that had happened, despite the cruel things he'd said and the way he'd treated me, I still loved Marcus. I wanted his marriage to succeed, but I also wanted Brianna to be protected if it didn't. How would it work? We'd need to find a way for Brianna to receive information about the importance of prenuptial agreements from what appears to be a neutral source. A friend, a coworker, an article she happens to read, something that makes her think about protecting herself without anyone pressuring her to do so. I spent 2 weeks thinking about it, weighing the ethics of helping someone who'd participated in cutting me out of her wedding, someone who'd stood by while my son emotionally manipulated me into near poverty. But every time I considered letting it go, I thought about Margaret, about the look on her face when she realized she'd been left with nothing. I thought about Brianna's parents, sacrificing their own financial security to give their daughter a beautiful wedding, trusting that she'd be taken care of in her marriage. In the end, it wasn't about Marcus or even about my hurt feelings. It was about preventing another young woman from learning too late that trust and love, while beautiful, aren't legal protection. Janet and I developed a plan. She knew a family law attorney, Rebecca Walsh, who specialized in prenuptial agreements for young couples. Rebecca would reach out to Brianna through what appeared to be a professional development program for teachers, offering free legal consultations about financial planning for newly married couples. It has to be her choice, I insisted. If she doesn't want a prenup, we don't push it. This is about giving her information and options, not manipulating her into anything. Understood. Rebecca is excellent at presenting information neutrally. If Miss Chen decides she wants a prenuptial agreement, Rebecca will draft something fair and protective for both parties. If she doesn't, we drop the matter completely. The consultation was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in late August, 6 weeks before the wedding. I spent that day in my garden, pretending to prune roses while my phone sat silent on the patio table. I'd given Rebecca my number in case any questions arose, but I'd asked her not to contact me unless absolutely necessary. The less I knew about the details, the better. At 4:30, my phone rang. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Rebecca Walsh. I wanted to update you on this afternoon's consultation." My heart hammered against my ribs. How did it go? "Very well. Miss Chen is a thoughtful young woman who asked intelligent questions about financial protection in marriage. She seemed particularly concerned about ensuring that both parties would be treated fairly if the relationship ended." "Did she want to proceed with a prenup?" "She did. She asked me to draft an agreement that would protect both her and her fiancé's individual assets, while ensuring that any property acquired during the marriage would be split equitably. She also wanted provisions for spousal support that would protect whichever party might be in a weaker financial position during a divorce." I closed my eyes, relief flooding through me. Brianna had chosen to protect herself. More than that, she'd chosen to protect both herself and Marcus, ensuring fairness rather than seeking advantage. What happens now? I'll draft the agreement and present it to both parties for review. Miss Chen will need to disclose the prenup to Mr. Patterson, of course. She seemed confident that he would be supportive of protecting both their interests. Confident that Marcus would be supportive. Sweet, trusting Brianna had no idea that her fiancé saw other people's assets as his own future security, that he might view a prenup as a threat to plans he hadn't shared with her. "Rebecca, what if he objects? Then we'll find out what kind of man Miss Chen is really marrying." The conversation I'd been dreading came 3 days later. I was deadheading petunias when my phone rang, Marcus's name flashing on the screen for the first time in 3 months. "Mom?" His voice was tight with barely controlled fury. "Hello, Marcus. It's good to hear from you. Did you have anything to do with Brianna's sudden interest in a prenuptial agreement?" The question hit me like ice water. How could he possibly know? Rebecca had been so careful. The consultation had appeared completely legitimate, a professional outreach program that connected with dozens of teachers across the district. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't lie to me. 3 months of silence, and suddenly my fiancé decides she needs legal protection from me? That's quite a coincidence. Marcus, I haven't spoken to Brianna since she told me she'd made other arrangements for the wedding." "But you've been busy, haven't you? Consulting with lawyers, asking questions about prenups and asset protection? Did you really think I wouldn't find out?" My blood turned to ice. How could he know about my consultations with Janet Morrison? Those conversations were protected by attorney-client privilege, completely confidential unless— "How do you know about my legal consultations?" "I have friends in the legal community, Mom. People talk, especially when a certain elderly widow starts asking lots of questions about protecting herself from family members who might take advantage." The violation felt as sharp as a physical assault. Somehow, Marcus had been monitoring my activities, keeping track of my legal consultations, my attempts to protect my own financial security. The son I'd raised had become someone who spied on his mother, who tracked her movements like she was a criminal rather than the one who'd given him life. "You've been having me watched. I've been protecting my interests. When someone suddenly starts consulting lawyers about asset protection and prenuptial agreements, it raises questions about their intentions. Protecting his interests? Not our relationship, not the family we'd once been, but his interests, as if I were a business rival rather than his mother. My intentions are to ensure my financial security for the rest of my life." "Your financial security?" He laughed, harsh and cold. "Mom, you're 72 years old. How much security do you really need?" There it was again, the casual dismissal of my remaining years as worthless, unworthy of planning or protection. In Marcus's world, I should spend my final decades in poverty rather than inconvenience him with my need to survive. I need enough security to live comfortably without being a burden to anyone. A burden to anyone? His voice dripped with sarcasm. Is that what you think you'd be? A burden? I think I'd be exactly what you told me I was. An embarrassment. Someone whose financial limitations interfere with your plans. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the words we couldn't take back, all the damage that had been done to something that was supposed to be unbreakable. The prenup is off the table, he said finally. That's not your decision to make alone. It's not yours to make at all. Stay out of my marriage, Mom. Stay out of my life. You've done enough damage. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone with shaking hands. The conversation had confirmed my worst fears. Marcus hadn't just wanted my money for his wedding. He'd wanted access to my assets, my security, my future. The prenup wasn't something he'd overlooked. It was something he'd deliberately avoided, keeping his finances separate while ensuring access to Brianna's trust and whatever inheritance she might receive from her hardworking parents. But I'd underestimated Brianna. When Rebecca called me the next morning, her voice carried a note of professional admiration. "Mrs. Patterson, I thought you should know that Miss Chen, now Mrs. Patterson, has filed for divorce." The words hit me like a physical blow. 3 months. The marriage had lasted 3 months. What happened? According to the filing, there were issues with financial deception and emotional abuse. Mrs. Patterson discovered that her husband had been hiding debts and had attempted to access her personal accounts without permission. There were also allegations of controlling behavior and threats of financial retaliation when she refused to comply with his demands. Financial deception, controlling behavior, threats of retaliation. The pattern that had destroyed my relationship with my son had destroyed his marriage as well. How is Brianna handling it? Better than most, thanks to the prenuptial agreement. Her individual assets are protected, including the house she inherited from her grandmother and the teacher's pension she'd been contributing to since college. Without the prenup, she would have been vulnerable to significant financial exploitation. I closed my eyes, remembering Margaret, remembering all the women who'd trusted completely and lost everything. Brianna would walk away from her marriage with her financial security intact, free to rebuild her life without the burden of debt and deception. Rebecca, did my involvement in arranging the prenup consultation come up in the divorce proceedings? It did. Mrs. Patterson mentioned that she'd received a professional consultation that had opened her eyes to the importance of financial protection in marriage. She specifically credited that consultation with giving her the tools she needed to protect herself. Does Marcus know? He suspects, based on his previous accusations, but suspicion isn't proof, and frankly, it doesn't matter now. The prenup is ironclad. The divorce will proceed according to its terms, and Mrs. Patterson will be protected. Protected. The word carried weight I'd never fully appreciated before. Protection wasn't just about money or assets. It was about preserving dignity, maintaining independence, ensuring that trust and love couldn't be weaponized against the people who offered them freely. 2 weeks later, I received an unexpected visitor. Brianna stood on my front porch in the February cold, her face drawn but determined, carrying a small gift bag and what looked like a thank you card. Mrs.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Patterson, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I know things have been difficult between you and Marcus, but I wanted to talk to you before I left town. I invited her in, made tea, and listened as she told me about the marriage that had unraveled almost from the wedding night. Marcus had expected immediate access to her accounts, had been furious when the prenup prevented him from using her inheritance as collateral for his business ventures. He threatened, manipulated, and finally resorted to the same emotional blackmail he'd used on me. I kept thinking about something my lawyer told me during our consultation, Brianna said, her hands wrapped around her tea mug for warmth. She said that people who truly love you won't be threatened by your need to protect yourself, that real love wants you to be safe and secure even if the relationship ends. Real love wants you to be safe and secure. The wisdom I'd wished someone had shared with me decades earlier, when I was young and trusting and believed that love meant giving everything without question. I'm glad you protected yourself, sweetheart. Mrs. Patterson, I know you didn't approve of the way Marcus treated you during the wedding planning. I should have spoken up then, should have defended you. I was so caught up in wedding excitement that I didn't see what was really happening. You were planning your future. That's natural. No, it was more than that. I was scared that if I disagreed with him about anything, he'd change his mind about marrying me. I was so afraid of losing him that I lost myself instead. Afraid of losing him. The fear that had driven so many of my own decisions over the years. The terror of disappointing my children that had led me to sacrifice my own needs and boundaries until I nearly lost everything. What will you do now? I'm moving to Denver. I got a job teaching at a private school there, working with children who have learning disabilities. It's something I've always wanted to do, but Marcus said it wouldn't pay enough, wasn't practical for our future plans. Our future plans. Plans that had never included her dreams, her goals, her vision of the life she wanted to build. I'm proud of you for choosing yourself. She smiled, the first genuine smile I'd seen from her in months. Mrs. Patterson, I have something to tell you. I know you arranged for me to meet with Rebecca Walsh. My heart stopped. How did you know? She told me after the divorce was finalized. She said there was someone who cared about my well-being enough to ensure I had access to good legal advice, someone who wanted me to be protected even though I'd participated in hurting them. I stared at her, waiting for anger, accusation, some sign that she resented my interference in her marriage. Instead, she reached across the table and took my hand. Thank you. That prenup saved my life, my financial security, my future. Without it, I'd be starting over with nothing but debt and broken dreams. Instead, I'm free to build the life I actually want. Free to build the life she actually wanted. The gift I'd tried to give her, the same gift I was finally learning to give myself. I'm sorry Marcus turned out to be someone different than you thought he was. I'm sorry too. But Mrs. Patterson, I want you to know that the marriage failing wasn't your fault. The problems weren't about the wedding money or family dynamics. They were about who Marcus really is when he doesn't get his way, when he can't control the people around him. Who Marcus really is. The son I'd raised had become someone I didn't recognize, someone who saw relationships as transactions and people as resources to be managed rather than loved. After Brianna left, I sat in my quiet kitchen thinking about the strange turns life can take. 6 months earlier, I'd been a mother desperate to maintain a relationship with my son, willing to sacrifice my financial security to avoid his anger. Now I was a woman who'd helped protect another woman from the same manipulation I'd experienced, who'd learned to choose self-preservation over people-pleasing. The phone rang as evening shadows stretched across my kitchen floor. I expected it to be Rachel calling for our weekly catch-up. Instead, Marcus's name flashed on the screen. I stared at the phone for several rings, debating whether to answer. What could he possibly have to say now? What new demand or manipulation could he have devised? Finally, I picked up. Hello, Marcus. Mom? His voice was different somehow, flatter, more defeated than I'd ever heard it. I know you helped Brianna get that prenup. There was no point in denying it anymore. Yes, I did. Why? The question hung in the air, loaded with hurt and confusion and something that might have been genuine bewilderment. Why would his mother protect his wife from him? Why would I interfere in his marriage when I'd been excluded from his life? Because she deserved to be protected. From me? From your own son? From anyone who might take advantage of her trust. Silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we'd both learned about each other over the past months. The divorce is going to cost me everything. No, Marcus, it's going to cost you exactly what's fair. Your assets remain yours, hers remain hers. That's what you agreed to when you signed the prenup. I signed it because she threatened to call off the wedding if I didn't. She gave you a boundary and you chose to respect it. That was the right choice. It was manipulation. No, son. Manipulation is demanding someone bankrupt themselves for your wedding and threatening to cut them off if they refuse. Manipulation is having your mother watched and her legal consultations monitored. Manipulation is trying to access your wife's accounts without permission. The accusations hung in the air like smoke, acrid and inescapable. I'd finally named the behavior I'd been unable to identify for so long, put words to the pain and confusion I'd felt for months. "I'm not a bad person, Mom." The words came out cracked and small, like those of the little boy who'd once cried in my arms after making a mistake. For a moment, my heart softened toward the child he'd been, the son I'd loved unconditionally for 35 years. "No, you're not a bad person, but you've made bad choices. You've hurt people who loved you, taken advantage of trust that was given freely." "I never meant to hurt anyone." Intent doesn't erase impact, Marcus. The people you've hurt are still hurt, regardless of what you meant to do. Another silence, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. "What do I do now?" For the first time in our conversation, he sounded like he was actually asking for guidance rather than demanding compliance. It was the opening I'd hoped for but never expected to receive. "You get help. You figure out why you think other people's resources belong to you, why you see relationships as transactions rather than connections. You learn to build a life that doesn't depend on taking from others. Will you help me?"
The question I'd been waiting for. The plea that would have sent me running to his rescue 6 months earlier. Now it filled me with sadness rather than relief. Helping Marcus hadn't been someone I could help for a long time, maybe years. The realization settled over me like winter twilight, gradual but inevitable. Helping him had become enabling him, and enabling him had nearly destroyed us both. "I can't help you anymore, Marcus, not the way you mean." What's that supposed to mean? It means I can't give you money, or solve your problems, or rescue you from the consequences of your choices. Those kinds of help haven't actually helped you at all. The silence that followed felt different than our previous pauses. This one carried weight, finality, the sound of doors closing that wouldn't open again. "So that's it? Your own son asks for help and you just abandon him?" "I'm not abandoning you. I'm refusing to participate in your self-destruction." "My self-destruction?" His voice rose, anger replacing the vulnerable tone he'd used moments before. "Mom, I'm getting divorced. My wife turned out to be a gold digger who planned this whole thing from the beginning. I need support, not lectures." Gold digger. He was calling Brianna, sweet kindergarten teacher Brianna, who'd worked 2 jobs to pay for her own college education, a gold digger. The woman who'd wanted a fair prenup that protected both parties, who'd walked away from the marriage with only what she'd brought into it, was somehow the villain in his story. Brianna isn't a gold digger, Marcus. She protected herself from financial abuse, which is exactly what she should have done. Financial abuse? I'm her husband. What's mine should be hers, and what's hers should be mine. That's how marriage works. That's how financial exploitation works. Marriage is a partnership, not a hostile takeover. You really believe that, don't you? You think your own son is some kind of predator? The word hung between us, ugly and accurate. Predator. Someone who identified vulnerable targets and systematically extracted resources from them. Someone who used emotional manipulation and threats to override their victims' resistance. Someone who saw relationships as hunting grounds rather than connections. I think you've learned to see other people's assets as your own future security. I think you've forgotten the difference between asking for help and demanding compliance. And I think you've been poisoned against your own family by lawyers and strangers who don't care about you. Poisoned against my own family. As if seeking legal protection from financial manipulation was betrayal rather than self-preservation. As if the lawyers and strangers had been the ones threatening to cut me off unless I bankrupted myself for a wedding. The lawyers didn't poison me, Marcus. They protected me. Just like Rebecca protected Brianna. Rebecca. He spat the name like profanity. Do you have any idea what that woman cost me? Not just in legal fees, but in the divorce settlement she negotiated. She cost you nothing, son. She prevented you from taking things that were never yours to begin with. Things that should have been mine. Brianna's inheritance, her pension contributions, even the house her grandmother left her. We were married. I should have had access to those assets. Should have had access. Not shared in, not benefited from, but had access to. The language of ownership, of entitlement, of someone who viewed marriage as a business acquisition rather than a life partnership. Why should you have access to assets Brianna earned before she even met you? Because that's what married couples do. They share resources, build a future together. What resources were you planning to share with her? The question caught him off guard. I could hear him scrambling for an answer that didn't reveal the truth we both knew. Marcus had expected complete access to Brianna's assets while protecting his own through careful legal structures she'd never been informed about. My salary, my business investments, my property holdings, which were all protected by the business entities you set up before the marriage, entities that kept them separate from any community property claims. Silence. He'd forgotten that I'd helped him establish those business protections years earlier, back when I'd still believed I was assisting my son's legitimate financial planning rather than enabling his systematic exploitation of others. That's different. How is it different? Those were legitimate business protections. And Brianna's prenup was legitimate personal protection. The only difference is that you consented to your protections and she didn't consent to giving up hers. She's my wife, was my wife. She should have trusted me. Trust. The weapon he'd wielded against everyone who'd ever tried to protect themselves from his financial demands. Trust me with your life savings. Trust me with your assets. Trust me to do right by you even when I'm actively demonstrating that I won't. Marcus, trust isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through consistent, trustworthy behavior. I never did anything untrustworthy. You hid your business protections from your wife while demanding access to her assets. You monitored my legal consultations and had me followed by private investigators. You threatened to cut me out of your wedding unless I gave you $90,000. Which part of that demonstrates trustworthy behavior? Each accusation landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of truth through the conversation. Marcus had no defense because there was no defense. The behavior spoke for itself. You don't understand the pressure I've been under. What pressure? Financial pressure, business obligations, the cost of maintaining a certain lifestyle. A certain lifestyle. The BMW, the expensive apartment, the country club membership, the vacations to Europe that he'd posted on social media while claiming he couldn't afford his own wedding. The lifestyle he'd maintained by extracting resources from everyone around him. Marcus, you make 6 figures. What financial pressure could you possibly be under that justifies trying to bankrupt your mother? You don't know what it's like trying to build wealth in this economy. Everything costs more than it used to. Property values, investment minimums, even basic living expenses. So does everyone else's everything. But most people don't solve that problem by taking money from their elderly parents. Most people don't have parents who could help but choose not to.
Choose not to. As if I'd refused out of selfishness rather than survival. As if preserving enough money to live on was a luxury rather than a necessity. I chose not to impoverish myself so you could have a party. It wasn't a party, Mom. It was my wedding, one of the most important days of my life. And preserving my financial security is the most important consideration of my remaining years. Why should your one day matter more than my next decade? The question hung in the air, exposing the fundamental selfishness that had driven all his demands. In Marcus's calculations, his temporary happiness outweighed my long-term survival. His wants superseded my needs. His convenience justified my hardship. You're 72 years old. There it was again, the casual dismissal of my remaining years as worthless. The assumption that age somehow diminished my right to security, comfort, and dignity. Yes, I am, and I plan to live at least another 20 years, possibly more. Would you prefer I spend those decades in poverty so you can remember one perfect day? That's not what I'm saying.
That's exactly what you're saying. You're saying my future doesn't matter as much as your past. I'm saying families should support each other. Families should protect each other, Marcus, not exploit each other. The conversation was becoming circular, each of us returning to the same fundamental disagreement about what family meant, what obligations existed between parent and child, what constituted reasonable requests versus manipulative demands. I never exploited anyone. You demanded $90,000 from your mother under threat of cutting her out of your wedding. What would you call that? I would call that asking family for help during an important life transition. And I would call that financial extortion. Financial extortion? He laughed, but there was no humor in it. Mom, you've been completely brainwashed by these lawyers. You're using legal terms for normal family interactions. Legal terms for normal family interactions? As if the existence of terms to describe his behavior somehow invalidated the behavior itself. As if calling exploitation by its name rather than the exploitation. Marcus, normal families don't threaten to cut off contact unless money changes hands. Normal families don't have parents monitored by private investigators. Normal families don't try to access their spouse's accounts without permission. Normal families support each other's major life events. Within reason, yes, but demanding someone's life savings isn't support, it's predation. There's that word again. It's an accurate word. You identified a vulnerable target, isolated her from support systems, applied escalating pressure until she either complied or was discarded as no longer useful. Vulnerable target? Mom, you're talking about yourself like you're a stranger. I'm talking about myself like I'm a person whose well-being matters, something you seem to have forgotten. The accusation hit harder than I'd intended. Marcus fell silent, and I could hear his breathing change, becoming more rapid and shallow. For a moment, I thought he might actually engage with what I was saying, might consider the possibility that his behavior had been harmful rather than reasonable. Instead, he went on the attack. You know what I think? I think you're bitter about Dad's death, and you're taking it out on me. Harold's death. 2 years later, and Marcus was still trying to weaponize my grief, still looking for emotional vulnerabilities he could exploit to regain control of the conversation. Don't bring your father into this. He would have wanted me to have a beautiful wedding. He would have found a way to make it happen. Your father would have found a way to contribute appropriately without bankrupting us. He never would have demanded everything we had for one day. You don't know what he would have done. I know he would never have threatened to cut his son out of his wedding over money. I know he would never have tried to access his daughter-in-law's accounts without permission. I know he would never have had his wife followed and monitored. Each comparison to Harold was a deliberate thrust, designed to highlight how far Marcus had strayed from the values we'd tried to instill in him. His father had been generous but not foolish, supportive but not enabling, loving but not manipulative. Dad's not here to defend himself. He doesn't need defending. His character speaks for itself, just like yours does, just like mine does. Marcus's voice turned cold, calculating. You know what, Mom? You're right about one thing. My character does speak for itself, and it says I don't need people in my life who see me as a predator and a threat. The threat was implicit but clear. Shape up or ship out. Change your perspective or lose your son. The same ultimatum he'd given me about the wedding. The same choice between compliance and abandonment. Is that another threat, Marcus? It's not a threat. It's a boundary. I don't have space in my life for people who think the worst of me. I don't think the worst of you. I think accurately of your behavior. My behavior, according to lawyers who don't know me, strangers who've never met me, people who profit from convincing you to see your family as enemies. Family as enemies? The phrase revealed everything about how Marcus viewed our situation. In his mind, any attempt to protect myself from his financial demands made me an enemy rather than a victim seeking safety. The lawyers didn't convince me of anything, Marcus. Your actions convinced me. Your words, your threats, your demands. My words. He seized on the phrase like a lifeline. What words? Show me exactly what I said that was so terrible. The challenge was designed to make me doubt my own memory, to gaslight me into believing that his demands had been reasonable and my response had been overreaction. It was a tactic I recognized from our wedding conversation, the attempt to reframe exploitation as normal family interaction. You told me that at 72, I didn't need much future security. You said I was embarrassing you by only offering $5,000. You demanded $90,000 for your wedding and threatened to uninvite me if I refused. I expressed frustration about your priorities. That's different than making threats. You said I didn't deserve to be part of your new family if I couldn't support your marriage. I said that if you couldn't support your son's happiness, maybe you shouldn't be at the wedding. That's not a threat, it's an observation. Observation. The reframing was masterful, turning emotional manipulation into casual commentary, threats into insights.
Marcus had perfected the art of saying devastating things while maintaining plausible deniability about their impact. It was manipulation designed to override my financial boundaries through fear of abandonment. It was honest communication about how your refusal made me feel. Your feelings don't justify financial extortion, and your paranoia doesn't justify destroying our relationship. We were back to the circular argument, each of us defending a fundamentally different interpretation of the same events. Marcus saw reasonable requests met with unreasonable resistance. I saw financial manipulation met with necessary boundaries. I'm not destroying our relationship, Marcus. I'm refusing to let you destroy my financial security. Your financial security is more important than your relationship with your son? The question was designed to make me choose, to force me into admitting that money mattered more to me than family. It was the same false choice he'd presented during the wedding conversation, the demand that I prove my love through financial sacrifice. My financial security is what allows me to have relationships from a position of strength rather than desperation. When someone's survival depends on others' generosity, they can't afford to set boundaries or resist exploitation. So you admit you see me as someone who would exploit you. I see you as someone who has exploited me, repeatedly, and who would continue to do so if I allowed it. The admission hung between us, stark and undeniable. For months, I'd been dancing around the truth, softening the language, trying to preserve his dignity while protecting my own interests. But the time for diplomatic phrasing had passed. If that's really what you think of me, then I guess we have nothing left to talk about. We have plenty to talk about if you're willing to acknowledge the harm you've caused and commit to changing your behavior. Change my behavior? He laughed, sharp and bitter. You mean change my personality? Change who I am? Become someone who doesn't need anything from anyone? I mean become someone who asks instead of demands, who accepts no as an answer, who builds relationships on mutual respect rather than financial obligation. Mutual respect? Like the respect you showed when you interfered in my marriage? Like the respect I showed when I protected a young woman from financial manipulation. You protected her from me, your own son? I protected her from anyone who might take advantage of her trust and vulnerability. The fact that you were the threat she needed protection from is something you should examine, not something I should apologize for. The conversation had reached the point of no return. Marcus was never going to acknowledge that his behavior had been harmful, was never going to take responsibility for the damage he'd caused, was never going to change the fundamental way he approached relationships with the people around him. I'm done with this conversation, Mom. I'm done with lawyers and threats and being treated like a criminal by my own family. I've never treated you like a criminal. I've treated you like someone whose behavior became dangerous to the people who trusted him. Same thing. No, it's not. Criminals are defined by their crimes. You're defined by your choices, and you can make different choices anytime you decide to. My choices are fine. It's your perception that's the problem. His perception versus mine. His reality versus the reality documented by lawyers, therapists, and divorce proceedings. His version of events versus the pattern of behavior that had destroyed multiple relationships and left a trail of financial devastation in its wake. Marcus, when everyone around you is telling you the same thing about your behavior, at what point do you consider that they might be right? When the people around me are family who love me instead of strangers who profit from division. Strangers who profit from division? The lawyers, the therapists, the mediators who'd helped various people protect themselves from Marcus's financial demands are now the villains in his story. Everyone except Marcus himself. The strangers didn't create the division, your behavior created it. They just helped people respond to it appropriately. Appropriately. The word dripped with contempt. You think it's appropriate for a wife to hide assets from her husband behind a prenup? I think it's appropriate for anyone to protect themselves from financial manipulation, regardless of the source. Even if the source is family? Especially if the source is family. Family relationships involve the deepest trust, which makes the betrayal more devastating when that trust is exploited. Betrayal. Marcus seized on the word. You think I betrayed you? The question carried genuine surprise, as if the possibility had never occurred to him. In his mind, demanding my life savings wasn't betrayal. Threatening to cut me out of his wedding wasn't betrayal. Having me monitored and followed wasn't betrayal. These were simply reasonable responses to my unreasonable resistance to his reasonable requests. Yes, Marcus, I think demanding someone's life savings under threat of abandonment is betrayal. I think having your mother followed and monitored is betrayal. I think trying to access your wife's accounts without permission is betrayal. I think you've redefined normal family interactions as betrayal so you can justify your selfishness. And I think you've redefined exploitation as normal so you can justify your behavior. We were at an impasse, each of us convinced of our own righteousness, each of us seeing the other as the source of the problem. But there was one crucial difference between our positions. My version of events was supported by documentation, by professional opinions, by legal proceedings that had examined the evidence objectively. Marcus's version was supported only by his own interpretation of his own actions. You know what the real tragedy is here, Mom? What's that? You're going to die alone, bitter, isolated, surrounded by lawyers instead of family. And for what? To protect money you'll never have time to spend anyway. The cruelty of those words took my breath away. Die alone, bitter, isolated. The fears every elderly person carries, weaponized against me by my own son. He was painting a picture of my future designed to terrify me back into compliance, to convince me that financial security without family approval was meaningless. I'd rather die alone with my dignity intact than die surrounded by people who see me as a resource to be depleted. Dignity, he laughed. Is that what you call this? Hiding behind lawyers and turning your back on your own child? I call it self-respect, something I should have developed years ago. Self-respect would be supporting your family when they need help. Self-respect is refusing to be exploited, even by people you love. And I call it selfishness disguised as strength. Call it whatever you want, Marcus. The result is the same. I'm not giving you money, I'm not apologizing for protecting myself, and I'm not going back to being the kind of mother who enables destructive behavior in the name of love. The silence that followed was different than our previous pauses. This one carried finality, the sound of decisions being made and positions being solidified. We'd both said everything there was to say. The rest was just repetition. I'm hanging up now, Mom. All right. Don't call me again unless you're ready to be a real mother instead of a paranoid stranger. A real mother. Someone who sacrificed her security for his convenience, who enabled his exploitation in the name of love, who confused self-destruction with family loyalty. Goodbye, Marcus. The line went dead. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after that conversation, watching the winter light fade across my snow-covered garden. The finality of it settled over me like a blanket, heavy but not unwelcome. For the first time in months, I knew exactly where I stood with my son. There would be no more negotiations, no more attempts at reconciliation, no more hoping that he might suddenly develop the capacity for self-reflection and change. Marcus had made his choice. He'd chosen his version of reality over any version that required him to examine his own behavior. He'd chosen righteousness over responsibility, indignation over insight. And in choosing those things, he'd chosen a life without his mother in it. The loss should have devastated me. This was my son, my firstborn, the child I'd carried and birthed and raised and loved for 35 years. His absence should have left a hole in my life that nothing could fill. Instead, I felt something unexpected: relief. Relief that I no longer had to walk on eggshells, measuring every word to avoid triggering his anger. Relief that I no longer had to defend my financial decisions to someone who saw my assets as his inheritance. Relief that I no longer had to pretend his behavior was normal, acceptable, or loving. The relationship had been over long before our final conversation. I'd just been too afraid of abandonment to acknowledge it. 3 days later, Janet Morrison called to check on my legal protections and ask about any new developments in my family situation. "How are you holding up, Mrs. Patterson?" "Better than I expected, sadder than I hoped, but stronger than I feared." That's a healthy perspective. Many people in your situation struggle with guilt about protecting themselves from family members. I did struggle with it for months, but I've realized that guilt is just another form of manipulation when it's used to override necessary boundaries. Have you heard from Marcus since the divorce was finalized? I told her about our final conversation, about his continued refusal to acknowledge any wrongdoing, about his demand that I choose between my financial security and his approval. How did you respond? I chose security and self-respect and the right to live my remaining years free from financial manipulation. Good for you. That took tremendous courage. Courage. The word felt strange applied to my situation. I'd never thought of protecting myself as brave, just necessary. But maybe there was courage in refusing to be a victim, in choosing dignity over enabling, in prioritizing survival over approval. "Janet, I want to update my will." "What changes do you want to make?" "I want to leave a significant portion of my estate to organizations that help victims of financial abuse, and I want to include a letter explaining why." "A letter to your family?" "A letter to Marcus specifically. I want him to understand that his behavior had consequences, that financial manipulation destroys relationships and trust. I want other families to have resources to protect themselves from what I experienced." That's a powerful legacy, Mrs. Patterson. A legacy. I'd never thought about my remaining years in those terms as something that could create positive change beyond my own survival. But maybe that was exactly what they could be. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it the kind of renewal that feels like possibility made visible. My garden responded to the warming soil with enthusiasm, sending up shoots and buds that promised beauty to come. I found myself spending hours outdoors, planning improvements, dreaming of the seasons ahead. Rachel visited in April, bringing her family for a long weekend that reminded me what healthy relationships actually looked like. Her children, my grandchildren, helped me plant tomatoes and asked endless questions about everything from soil composition to butterfly migration. Their curiosity was infectious, their energy healing. "Mom, you look different," Rachel said as we sat on my back porch watching the kids chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Different how?" "Lighter somehow. Less burdened." Less burdened. The perfect description for what I'd achieved by refusing to carry Marcus's financial demands, emotional manipulation, and toxic sense of entitlement. I've been learning to put down things that were too heavy for me to carry. Things like guilt over setting boundaries with Marcus. Things like responsibility for his choices, for his happiness, for his financial problems. Things that were never mine to begin with. Rachel nodded.
understanding without explanation the freedom that comes from accepting your own limitations, from choosing self-preservation over self-destruction. Have you heard from him at all? No, and I don't expect to. Marcus has made it clear that our relationship depends on my willingness to be financially exploited. Since I'm not willing, there's no relationship. Are you okay with that? The question deserved honest consideration. Was I okay with losing my son? With accepting that the child I'd raised had become someone I couldn't have in my life without risking my own security and well-being? I'm okay with it because the alternative was worse. The alternative was spending my remaining years being systematically drained of resources and dignity by someone who saw me as an obstacle rather than a person. Do you think he'll ever change? I think he'll change if and when the consequences of his behavior become more costly than the benefits. Right now, he still sees himself as the victim of other people's unreasonable expectations, rather than the architect of his own isolation. What would it take for him to see it differently? Probably losing enough people he cares about that he's forced to examine the common denominator. But that's not my responsibility anymore. My responsibility is to live my own life well. Living my own life well. The concept had seemed impossible during the worst of Marcus's financial demands, when every decision felt like a choice between his happiness and my survival. Now it felt not just possible, but inevitable, the natural result of refusing to sacrifice my future for someone else's immediate gratification. In May, I received an unexpected letter from Brianna. She was settled in Denver, thriving in her new job, building friendships and discovering parts of herself that had been suppressed during her marriage. Her words carried a lightness that reminded me of my own emerging sense of freedom. "Mrs. Patterson," she wrote, "I wanted you to know that the prenup you helped arrange didn't just protect my financial assets. It protected my sense of self-worth, my ability to trust my own judgment, my belief that I deserved to be treated with respect rather than seen as a resource to be managed. You gave me tools I didn't know I needed, and I will be grateful for that gift for the rest of my life." Tools she didn't know she needed. That phrase resonated with my own experience of discovering that protecting yourself from family manipulation wasn't betrayal, but wisdom. That choosing financial security over emotional blackmail wasn't selfishness, but survival. I wrote back, sharing some of my own journey towards self-protection and boundary setting, offering encouragement for her new life and gratitude for her courage in leaving a marriage that had become exploitative rather than supportive. Our correspondence became regular, a connection between two women who'd learned to value their own well-being over other people's comfort, who'd chosen difficult freedom over easy exploitation. In July, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. I sold my house. The decision wasn't driven by financial necessity or family pressure or any external force. It was driven by my own vision of how I wanted to spend my remaining years. The house was too large for my needs, too full of memories, both good and painful, too tied to a version of myself that no longer existed. I found a beautiful condominium in a community designed for active seniors, a place where I could garden, travel, take classes, and build new friendships without the burden of maintaining a property that had become more obligation than joy. The real estate transaction was smooth and profitable, adding substantially to my retirement security, fulfilling the promise I'd made to myself months earlier. Marcus never contacted me about the sale, though I'm sure he heard about it through mutual acquaintances.
His silence spoke volumes about his true priorities. If he genuinely cared about our relationship, about family history, about maintaining connections, he would have reached out. His absence confirmed that his primary interest had been my assets rather than my well-being. Moving day arrived in early September, bringing with it a crew of professional movers who handled my belongings with care and efficiency. I kept only what I truly loved, donating the rest to charities that would ensure they found new homes with people who needed them. As I walked through the empty rooms one last time, I felt no sadness or regret. The house had served its purpose, sheltering my family through decades of growth and change. Now it would shelter someone else's family, someone else's dreams and sorrows and celebrations. My new home was everything I'd hoped it would be: bright,
Modern, efficiently designed, surrounded by gardens I could enjoy without maintaining. The community offered activities, social opportunities, and the kind of supportive environment that made aging feel like adventure rather than decline. For the first time in years, I was excited about the future rather than anxious about it. October brought my first wedding anniversary as a divorced woman, though the phrase felt odd applied to someone who'd been widowed rather than divorced. But in a sense, I had divorced someone that year. I'd divorced the version of myself that enabled exploitation in the name of love, that confused self-sacrifice with virtue, that allowed fear of abandonment to override healthy self-preservation. I celebrated quietly with a bottle of good wine and a long bath, toasting the woman I'd become and the choices that had brought me to this place of security and peace. November arrived with its familiar reminder of gratitude season, the time of year when people traditionally count their blessings and acknowledge the good in their lives. My list was longer than it had been in years. I was grateful for Janet Morrison, who taught me that protecting yourself from family exploitation wasn't selfishness, but wisdom. I was grateful for Rebecca Walsh, who'd helped Brianna secure the legal protections that saved her from financial devastation. I was grateful for my daughter Rachel, whose love didn't come with financial conditions or manipulative demands. I was grateful for Brianna's courage in leaving a harmful marriage and rebuilding her life on her own terms. I was grateful for my own courage in setting boundaries that protected my security and dignity. Most surprisingly, I found myself grateful for Marcus's final conversation, the one where he'd made it clear that our relationship would continue only if I submitted to financial exploitation. His ultimatum had freed me from the exhausting cycle of hoping for change, of making excuses for behavior I couldn't excuse, of loving someone who saw me as a resource rather than a person. December brought holiday invitations from my new community, opportunities to celebrate with people who appreciated my company without expecting my money. The contrast with previous years was stark and wonderful. For the first time in decades, I approached the holiday season with anticipation, excitement rather than dread. Rachel and her family came to visit my new home, bringing warmth and laughter and the kind of unconditional love that asks nothing more than presence and attention. We cooked together, decorated together, shared stories and dreams and the comfortable silences that come with deep affection. "Mom," Rachel said as we sat by my fireplace on Christmas Eve, "I'm proud of you." "For what?" "For choosing yourself, for refusing to be diminished by someone else's demands, for building a life that honors who you are rather than who other people want you to be, who I was rather than who other people wanted me to be." The phrase captured something essential about the transformation I'd undergone, the shift from people-pleasing to self-respecting, from enabling to empowering. "It was the hardest thing I've ever done," I admitted. "Harder than losing your father, harder than anything I thought I'd survive. But you did survive it, and you didn't just survive, you thrived." Thrived. The word felt accurate in a way I hadn't expected. I had thrived, not despite losing Marcus, but because of freeing myself from his exploitation. The energy I'd been spending on managing his demands and defending my boundaries was now available for relationships and activities that actually nourished me. As the year drew to a close, I found myself looking forward rather than backward, planning rather than grieving, hoping rather than fearful. The woman who'd once been terrified of abandonment had discovered that the right kind of solitude was infinitely preferable to the wrong kind of company. Marcus had given me an ultimatum designed to force my compliance through fear. Instead, it had forced my liberation through courage. The choice between his approval and my security had seemed impossible when he'd presented it. Now it seemed obvious, inevitable, the only choice that honored both my past and my future. I'd chosen myself and discovered that I was worth choosing. The call came on a cold February morning, 18 months after Marcus and I had last spoken. I was enjoying coffee on my balcony, watching the sunrise paint the mountains in shades of rose and gold, when my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Patterson, this is Detective Sarah Chen with the Denver Police Department." My blood turned to ice. Detective, police, Denver, where Brianna lived. "Is Brianna all right?" "Ma'am, I'm calling about your son, Marcus Patterson. He's been arrested on charges of financial fraud and identity theft. The words seemed to float in the air, disconnected from reality. Marcus, arrested. Financial fraud. The son I'd raised, whatever he'd become, was now sitting in a jail cell facing criminal charges. What happened? According to our investigation, Mr. Patterson has been using false identities to obtain credit cards and loans, then defaulting on the debts. He also attempted to access his ex-wife's bank accounts using forged documents. We found evidence of similar schemes involving elderly family members and former business associates. Elderly family members. The phrase hit me like a physical blow. Had Marcus tried to access my accounts? Had he been planning some elaborate scheme to steal my money while maintaining his facade of righteous indignation? Ma'am, we need to ask you some questions about your financial relationship with your son. Can you come to the station, or would you prefer we conduct the interview by phone? I'll come to Denver. The drive gave me time to process what I'd learned, to piece together the pattern that had been invisible to me during our long conflict. Marcus hadn't just been demanding money from family members. He'd been systematically defrauding strangers, creating false identities, forging documents, building an elaborate criminal enterprise to maintain his lifestyle without earning it. The detective who interviewed me was professional and thorough, walking me through Marcus's demands for wedding money, his threats to cut me off, his attempts to monitor my legal consultations. She listened without judgment as I described his pattern of financial manipulation, his sense of entitlement to other people's assets, his inability to accept boundaries or limitations. Mrs. Patterson, your son's criminal behavior appears to have escalated significantly after his divorce. We believe the financial protections his ex-wife put in place may have forced him to seek alternative sources of income. Alternative sources of income. Fraud, forgery, identity theft. When legitimate manipulation failed, Marcus had turned to outright criminality. How did you catch him? His ex-wife reported suspicious activity on her accounts. When we investigated, we discovered a paper trail linking him to multiple fraudulent schemes. He wasn't particularly careful about covering his tracks. Brianna had been the one to report him. Sweet, trusting Brianna, who'd once worried about being too suspicious of her husband's financial behavior. The prenup had protected her assets, but her vigilance had protected countless future victims. What happens now? He's facing multiple felony charges. Given the scope of the fraud and the number of victims, he's looking at significant prison time if convicted. Prison time. My son, the boy I'd taught to ride a bicycle and helped with homework and cheered at soccer games, was facing years behind bars for crimes that stemmed from the same entitlement that had destroyed our relationship. The next few weeks passed in a surreal haze of legal proceedings, media coverage, and phone calls from relatives and friends who'd heard about Marcus's arrest. The local newspaper ran a story about the elaborate fraud scheme, describing Marcus as a serial con artist who targeted elderly victims and used family connections to gain trust before stealing their life savings. Serial con artist. The phrase applied to my son, the child I'd raised to be honest and responsible and caring. Somewhere along the way, those values had been replaced by something darker, more calculating, more destructive. Rachel called daily, checking on my emotional state, offering support and perspective. Her concern was touching but unnecessary. The arrest had been shocking but not devastating. In some ways, it felt like vindication of every boundary I'd set, every protection I'd put in place, every intuition I'd followed despite Marcus's manipulation. Mom, are you okay?
Really? Okay? I'm sad for the victims he hurt. I'm sad for the boy he used to be. But I'm not surprised by what he became. Not surprised? The same entitlement that made him demand my life savings made him think he deserved other people's money without earning it. The same manipulation he used on me, he used on strangers. The only difference was the scale. Rachel was quiet for a moment, processing the connections I'd drawn between Marcus's treatment of family and his criminal behavior toward strangers. Do you think you'll visit him in jail? The question had been haunting me since the arrest. Did I owe him a visit? Did maternal love require me to offer support even when he faced the consequences of his own choices? No, I don't think seeing me would help him, and I know it wouldn't help me. Are you sure? Rachel, Marcus spent our last conversation telling me I would die alone and bitter, surrounded by lawyers instead of family. He made it clear that our relationship was conditional on my willingness to be financially exploited. I'm not going to pretend those conditions have changed just because he's facing consequences. But he's still your son. He's still the person who chose criminality over legitimate work, fraud over honesty, exploitation over connection. Being my son doesn't erase the choices he made or the people he hurt. The conversation with Rachel crystallized something I'd been struggling with since the arrest. I loved the memory of the child Marcus had been, but I couldn't love or support the man he'd become. Those were two different people, separated by years of choices that had led him further and further from the values I'd tried to instill. 3 months after his arrest, Marcus's case went to trial. I didn't attend, but I followed the proceedings through news reports and updates from the prosecutor's office. The evidence was overwhelming. Financial records, forged documents, victim testimony that painted a picture of systematic fraud spanning several years. Brianna testified about his attempts to access her accounts, about the financial pressure he'd applied during their marriage, about the patterns of behavior that had made her seek legal protection. Her testimony was clear, factual, devastating in its implications about Marcus's character and intentions. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Marcus was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison, with restitution orders totaling more than $200,000. 8 years. He would be 43 when he was released, assuming good behavior and early parole. Old enough to have learned from his mistakes, but young enough to rebuild his life legitimately if he chose to do so. The sentencing brought a strange sense of closure to the long conflict between us. Marcus had made his choices, faced their consequences, and would now have years to contemplate the path that had brought him to this point. Whether he used that time for reflection and growth or for resentment and blame was entirely up to him. I sent him one letter after the sentencing, not to offer comfort or make amends, but to provide clarity about our relationship going forward. Marcus, I wrote, I hope you use your time in prison to examine the choices that brought you here. I hope you develop genuine empathy for the people you hurt and real remorse for the damage you caused. I hope you find a way to build an honest life when you're released, but I won't be part of that process. The boundary I established years ago remains in place. Take care of yourself. I never received a reply, and I didn't expect one. The letter was for my own sense of completion, not for his response or approval. Summer arrived with its familiar invitation to growth and renewal. My garden flourished in its second year, producing tomatoes and peppers that I shared with neighbors who'd become genuine friends. The community I joined offered book clubs and hiking groups and volunteer opportunities that filled my days with purpose and connection. For the first time in years, I felt genuinely content with my life. Not just relieved or protected or vindicated, but actively happy with the choices I'd made and the path I'd chosen. Brianna visited in August, taking a long weekend to catch up and celebrate her engagement to a fellow teacher she'd met in Denver. Her fiancé was kind and supportive, someone who encouraged her independence rather than trying to control or exploit it. They'd written a prenup together, she told me with a smile, protecting both their assets and their individual dreams. I learned from the best teacher, she said, raising her wine glass in a toast to my kitchen table where we'd shared so many conversations about boundaries and self-protection. You learned from experience, the best teacher there is. We talked late into the night about healing from financial abuse, about recognizing red flags in relationships, about the difference between healthy interdependence and exploitative dependence. Our conversation felt like coming full circle, from the vulnerable young woman who'd needed protection to the confident adult who now helps others recognize and resist manipulation. Mrs. Patterson, can I ask you something personal? Of course. Do you ever regret the choices you made? The boundaries you set with Marcus? The question deserved honest consideration. Did I regret choosing my financial security over his wedding demands? Did I regret protecting myself from exploitation even when it cost me my relationship with my son? I regret that those choices were necessary. I regret that Marcus became someone I needed protection from. But I don't regret protecting myself or helping you protect yourself. Those were the right choices, given who he'd become. Even knowing how it would end, prison, the complete breakdown of your relationship, Brianna, the relationship was already broken. Marcus had turned it into a transaction where my love was measured by my willingness to be financially exploited. That's not a relationship worth preserving, even with your own child. She nodded, understanding the painful wisdom that comes from choosing difficult freedom over comfortable exploitation. What do you think you'd tell other parents in similar situations? I'd tell them that enabling destructive behavior isn't loving, it's harmful. I'd tell them that protecting yourself from exploitation isn't selfish, it's necessary. I'd tell them that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to participate in someone else's self-destruction. And what about adult children who are demanding financial support from elderly parents? I'd tell them that love doesn't come with a price tag, that family relationships shouldn't be financial transactions, that genuine need is very different from entitled demand. Our conversation continued past midnight, covering territory I'd never expected to navigate when I first refused to pay for Marcus's wedding. Financial abuse, family manipulation, the courage required to set boundaries with people you love, the long-term consequences of choosing self-preservation over people-pleasing. Fall brought news of Marcus's life in prison through indirect channels. He was working in the library, attending educational programs, keeping to himself mostly. No word of remorse or acknowledgement of the harm he'd caused, but no reports of continued manipulation or exploitation either. I found myself hoping he was using the time constructively, not for reconciliation between us, but for his own growth and healing. The anger and entitlement that had driven his criminal behavior would need to be addressed if he was ever going to build legitimate relationships based on mutual respect rather than financial advantage. Whether that work happened or not was beyond my control and outside my responsibility. Winter settled over my new life with familiar comfort. I'd been in my condominium for over a year now, long enough for it to feel like home rather than temporary shelter. The community had embraced me, involving me in holiday celebrations and social events that filled my calendar with genuine connection rather than obligatory family drama. Rachel's family spent Christmas with me, bringing laughter and warmth and the kind of unconditional love that asks nothing more than presence and appreciation. My grandchildren had grown taller and more curious, asking thoughtful questions about everything from constellation patterns to cookie recipes. "Grandma," my granddaughter Emma, as we decorated cookies on Christmas Eve, "why don't we ever talk about Uncle Marcus?" The question caught me off guard. Emma was 12, old enough to remember Marcus from family gatherings before our estrangement, old enough to notice his absence from our holiday celebrations. I looked at Rachel, who nodded encouragingly. We'd discussed how to handle questions about Marcus, agreeing that age-appropriate honesty was better than silence or euphemism. Uncle Marcus made some choices that hurt people, including me. Sometimes when people hurt us repeatedly, we need to protect ourselves by limiting contact with them. Is he a bad person? He's a person who made bad choices. There's a difference. Emma considered this carefully, the way children do when processing complex adult realities. Will he ever make better choices? I hope so. But even if he does, that doesn't mean the relationships he damaged can be fixed. Sometimes the hurt is too deep or too extensive for repair.
That makes me sad. It makes me sad too, sweetheart. But sometimes sadness is the price we pay for protecting ourselves and the people we love. Rachel squeezed my hand across the cookie decorating table, a gesture of support and understanding. Explaining Marcus's absence to her children had been one of her challenges as well, balancing honesty with age-appropriate information, acknowledging loss while emphasizing the importance of healthy boundaries. As the evening wound down and Emma returned to decorating cookies with renewed focus, I reflected on how different this Christmas felt from the previous year's anxiety and uncertainty.
I was no longer walking on eggshells, no longer managing anyone else's expectations or demands, no longer sacrificing my own peace for someone else's convenience. The simplicity was revolutionary. Spring brought an unexpected opportunity that felt like the universe offering confirmation of the path I'd chosen. A local nonprofit organization working with financial abuse victims asked me to speak at their annual fundraising dinner about my experience with family exploitation and recovery. Standing before an audience of survivors, advocates, and supporters, I shared the story of Marcus's demands, my initial compliance attempts, and the gradual awakening that led me to prioritize my own security over his approval. I talked about the legal protections I'd established, the boundaries I'd learned to maintain, and the unexpected freedom that came from refusing to be exploited even by someone I loved. The response was overwhelming. Audience members approached me afterward with their own stories of family financial manipulation, their own struggles with guilt and obligation, their own journeys towards self-protection and independence. "You gave me permission to protect myself," one elderly woman told me, tears in her eyes. "My daughter has been pressuring me to take out loans against my house to fund her business ventures. I thought saying no made me a bad mother." "Saying no makes you a wise woman who recognizes the difference between helping and enabling," I replied. "My son tells me I'm selfish for not giving him my savings for his investment schemes," another woman shared. "He says real mothers sacrifice everything for their children's success." "Real mothers teach their children to earn their own success rather than steal it from others," I answered. Conversation after conversation revealed the same pattern: adult children who viewed their parents' assets as their own future inheritance. Elderly parents who felt guilty for wanting to preserve their own financial security. Family relationships corrupted by financial manipulation disguised as love and obligation. The evening reinforced my conviction that protecting myself from Marcus's exploitation hadn't been selfishness but survival, hadn't been betrayal but wisdom, hadn't been failure but success in recognizing and resisting a toxic dynamic that could have destroyed my remaining years. As summer arrived with its promise of continued growth and possibility, I received an unexpected piece of news that brought the long saga with Marcus to its final resolution. Rebecca Walsh called to inform me that Marcus had attempted to contest his father's will from prison, claiming that Harold had promised him specific assets that weren't mentioned in the legal documents. The contest was frivolous and easily dismissed, since Harold's will had been carefully drafted and properly executed years before his death. But the attempt revealed that even imprisonment hadn't changed Marcus's fundamental character. He was still looking for financial advantages, still trying to claim assets that belonged to others, still operating from the same sense of entitlement that had destroyed our relationship and led to his criminal convictions. "He's representing himself," Rebecca told me, which suggests he either can't afford an attorney or can't find one willing to take such a weak case. "What happens if he loses?" "Nothing significant. The will remains unchanged and he's absorbed the filing fees and court costs. It's more of a nuisance than a threat." "And if he somehow wins?" "He won't. The documentation is ironclad, and his criminal convictions actually strengthen our position that he's attempting fraud rather than pursuing legitimate claims." The attempted will contest felt like Marcus's final gift to me, a clear demonstration that imprisonment hadn't brought insight or remorse or genuine change. He was still the same person who believed other people's assets belonged to him, still the same son who saw his family as a resource to be exploited rather than relationships to be cherished. Any lingering guilt I might have felt about our estrangement evaporated completely. This was who Marcus was, who he'd chosen to become, who he remained even after facing the consequences of his choices. My decision to protect myself from his exploitation hadn't been premature or harsh. It had been prescient and necessary. The will contest was dismissed within 6 months, exactly as Rebecca had predicted. Marcus was ordered to pay court costs and legal fees, adding to his already substantial restitution obligations. The judge's ruling included language describing the contest as frivolous and potentially fraudulent, ensuring that any future attempts to challenge Harold's estate would face additional scrutiny. With that final legal resolution, the chapter of my life that had included Marcus finally closed completely. There would be no more demands, no more manipulation, no more attempts to access assets that had never belonged to him. The boundaries I'd established years earlier had held, protecting not just my financial security, but my peace of mind and emotional well-being. As I write this story 2 years after Marcus's sentencing, I'm 75 years old and have never been happier or more content with my life. My days are filled with meaningful activities, genuine friendships, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from living according to your own values rather than other people's expectations. I volunteer regularly with the Financial Abuse Prevention Organization, helping other elderly victims recognize manipulation and establish protection. My story has become part of their educational materials, a case study in successful resistance to family exploitation. Rachel visits frequently with her growing children, bringing the kind of unconditional love that enriches rather than depletes, that asks for presence rather than money, that celebrates boundaries rather than trying to override them. Our relationship has deepened through shared understanding of what healthy family dynamics actually look like. Brianna married her teacher fiancé in a small ceremony last fall, sending me photos and a heartfelt note thanking me again for the protection that allowed her to rebuild her life with wisdom and caution. Her new marriage appears to be everything her first one wasn't: respectful, supportive, genuinely partnership-based. My financial security remains strong, protected by the legal structures Janet Morrison helped me establish and defended by the boundaries I learned to maintain. The money Marcus demanded for his wedding has instead funded my comfortable retirement, my charitable contributions, and the peace of mind that comes from knowing I can age with dignity rather than dependence. Sometimes people ask if I miss Marcus, if I regret the estrangement, if I hope for eventual reconciliation. My answer is always the same. I miss the child he was, but I don't miss the man he became. I regret that protection became necessary, but I don't regret protecting myself. I hope he finds genuine healing and wisdom, but I won't sacrifice my well-being to facilitate that process. The prenup I secretly funded changed everything, exactly as the title of this story promises, but not in the way Marcus expected. He thought it would cost him money in a divorce. Instead, it cost him the ability to exploit his wife the same way he tried to exploit his mother. It forced him to seek alternative sources of unearned income, leading to the criminal behavior that ultimately landed him in prison. Brianna's protection became the catalyst for Marcus's downfall, not because the prenup was malicious, but because it was effective. When legitimate manipulation failed, he turned to illegitimate schemes. When family members stopped enabling his exploitation, he started exploiting strangers. When the people who loved him established boundaries, he crossed legal boundaries instead. The prenup didn't destroy Marcus. His own choices destroyed him. The prenup simply prevented him from destroying others in the process. That distinction matters more than I can express. For years, I worried that protecting myself from Marcus's financial demands might somehow contribute to his problems or push him toward destructive behavior. The arrest and trial made it clear that his problems and destructive behavior existed independent of my boundaries. My protection didn't create his criminality. It simply prevented me from becoming one of his victims. As I sit in my garden on this spring morning, surrounded by flowers I planted and tended without interference from anyone else's demands or expectations, I'm grateful for every difficult choice that brought me to this place of peace. The refusal to fund the wedding, the establishment of legal protections, the boundaries with Marcus, the support for Brianna's prenup, the decision to prioritize my own security over family approval. Each choice felt impossible when I was making it. Together, they created a life that feels not just possible, but joyful. The phone rings occasionally with calls from other elderly parents facing similar manipulation from adult children. They've heard my story through the nonprofit organization or mutual friends, and they're looking for guidance about how to protect themselves without destroying family relationships. My advice is always the same. Healthy relationships don't require you to choose between your security and someone else's approval. If that choice is being forced on you, the relationship is already damaged beyond your ability to repair through compliance. Protection isn't betrayal, it's wisdom.